Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. This is the 5th of December. So now I can start getting a little bit Christmassy with a logo. I'll make it a little bit more Christmassy probably every week. Actually, a lot of really cool updates this week. And as always, this is useful. Please like, subscribe, comment and share and hit that bell icon to get notified of new updates. As always, I have the chapters in the description. You can kind of click along the bottom here if you want to jump to a certain update that interests you, maybe more than others. New videos this week. I spent pretty much the entire Thanksgiving week off creating and drafting an AZ305 study cram. So this, remember, along with the Azure Administrator certification, now gets you the Azure Architect certification. So you go and get the Azure Admin, then take the 305. It is in beta right now, so you won't get the results straight away. But this is just over 3.5 hours long. It's all of the key kind of information. I also created a playlist that goes with that to help, and it builds on my Azure Admin playlist. So do that first, then study those, and hopefully, good luck. New updates. So for Azure Kubernetes Service, some nice things around Node Image Auto Upgrade and Kubernetes Auto Upgrades. This is now generally available. What this lets me do is for the Kubernetes version, I get different options. For example, automatically update me to the new patch version, but on the same minor version. So it won't upgrade to a newer minor version. I can say, upgrade me automatically to the latest stable version. So N-1 for kind of that minor, or just rapid, get me on the newest minor, the newest patch, just get me there automatically. There's also a node image auto upgrade, so it will upgrade the images actually of the nodes themselves running the containers. And if I'm using maintenance windows where I define where those upgrades should happen, those will be respected with that. Auto certificate rotation is now GA, so there are certificates used between the control plane and then the actual nodes themselves. So now prior to expiration, those will get auto-rotated both in the control plane and on the nodes. It's only in certain regions today, but I think by February 2022, it should be rolled out to all regions. And then no local accounts has gone GA. Previously, we would still have certain local accounts on the Kubernetes cluster we would use, but now with the Azure AD integration, we have the option to not even have a local administrator account for Kubernetes. Instead, we'll use those Azure AD users and groups and grant those RBAC roles to Kubernetes, through which I can now do all of the management. So I can totally get rid of all of those local accounts. On the networking side, so Azure App Gateway now has wildcard support for multi-site listeners. So if I think about App Gateway, we can have different types of listeners connecting to certain IPs on the App Gateway and certain ports. Well, I can have multiple listeners using the same IP and same port. And what they do is they look at the fully qualified domain name that was used in the request. Well, now I can actually use wildcards. I can use star, asterisk, and I can use the question mark for individual characters actually as part of those listeners. So if I was to jump over super quickly, if I go and look here, if I quickly search on App Gateway, what we can see in my configuration, if I look at my listeners, I have a regular listener over here, this kind of first one, where it's just, hey, HTTP port 80, and it just goes to a particular rule. Then you can also see, well, I have these two listeners above it. Well, they're actually using the host name. These are multi-site listeners. So I have the same port and IP used for two different rules. And so what they actually do is, as part of that rule, I specify the host names. So here you can see I'm using both kind of that asterisk, the wildcard, and I'm using the question marks for specific characters. So now as part of my multi-site listener rules, I can use wildcards as part of that. So that's a nice ability now to maybe streamline the rule specifications I have. So I don't have to list every single fully qualified domain name. I can use those wildcards. VPN Gateway NAT has gone generally available. So this is all based around the idea that maybe I'm connecting branches to a virtual network that have overlapping IP spaces, or maybe even my virtual network IP range overlaps with certain branches. So what I can do with the NAT functionality is specify IP ranges to use as part of ingress and egress rules, and it will use NAT to translate the IP spaces when it's going to the branches, when it's coming from the branches, so I can cure any IP overlap problems. It has two different modes. There's a static mode where I have to give an equivalent sized IP range as part of the rules, or there's actually a dynamic. So with dynamic, based on the IP and ports, there's just a pool of IP addresses and one will get used as required that is available. That's obviously going to be a more streamlined approach. It's going to use less IP ranges. But that is now generally available. So great news if you do have those IP overlapping problems with branches, maybe branches to the virtual network. And then Virtual Network Manager, so that's in preview, I think still, yep. Now has Network Watcher tool support in GA. So Network Watcher has a whole set of great capabilities. Now, some of those are all based about network security groups, which are controlling flows of traffic. So Virtual Network Manager does a number of different things. One of the things it can do is I can describe a structure I want of relationships between virtual networks. Maybe it's a full mesh, maybe it's hub and spoke, and it will go and create the peerings for me. But the other things it does, it has its own rules mechanism that, just like NSGs, control the flow of traffic. Now, the Virtual Network Manager rules, think of it like funnels. So the Virtual Network Manager rules apply first, and then the NSGs would apply. But previously, the Network Watcher tools that looked at NSGs weren't considering the Virtual Network Manager rules, so it wouldn't consider them. Well, now it does. So if I'm using like IP flow verify to check, well, would this get from here to here? It will consider those Virtual Network Manager rules in addition to the NSGs. And likewise, if I look at effective security rules from Network Watcher, it will also show me those Virtual Network Manager rules as well. So it's really just bringing those all together. On the storage side, Azure NetApp Files now has SAP HANA application volume groups in preview. Remember, Azure NetApp Files is an Azure service using NetApp filers, so it gives me very, very high performance options. And when I use SAP HANA, there's a whole bunch of different volumes I have to have. There's data, there's log, there's shared, there's log backups, there's file backup. What this is going to do is basically create them all for me as a single action in a best practices configuration. So it's really going to speed up the time to deploy those solutions. So that is available in preview. On the database side, Azure Flexible PostgreSQL has gone GA. So the Azure Flexible MySQL went GA a couple of weeks ago. So now Postgres has joined it. So this is different from the single server solutions, which were more based around a container type technology. These are built on virtual machines and give me a lot of additional features. There's configuration. It's probably easier to see this. So some of the nice things I can actually do with these flexible offerings is I get far more granular control. If I quickly go and look at my Postgres, one of the things I can do here is, well, firstly, in terms of tweaking the different dials, I have access to about 300 different settings that I can configure on this Postgres. You can see down here at the bottom, there's pages and pages of these different settings that I can actually use. I can obviously go and search for a particular one I want up here. So I have full control of that. I can set maintenance windows for when I want various things to happen. There's rich backup restore integrations. I could add high availability. Now I don't have that turned on, but I could turn on high availability. So that's a synchronous replication to another instance. Obviously it's going to double the cost, but that other instance could be in a different AZ to give me nice resiliency from a availability zone level failure. Or I can opt to put it in the same AZ. I lose some protection there, but I get the smallest possible latency that will be available. It supports burstable virtual machine types. When I go through the provisioning experience, it actually asks me questions. Hey, how are you going to use this? And here you can see I picked this idea of, hey, I'd said it's development, so it's giving me a really super cheap option. And notice also I can stop these. So for up to 30 days, I can basically stop paying the compute charge. Now, from a networking perspective, what these do is either it's public access, and I can lock it down by certain IP rules, or it uses a delegated subnet. It deploys into a subnet in your virtual network. So it's not using private endpoints. It's actually using a delegated subnet into your virtual network. So that's really where we are right now. But this is a great offering. It gives me a lot of nice features there. Geo-redundant backup restore is in preview. So this is where the backup data it creates is GRS, so it's replicated to the paired region, and I can do a cross-region restore if I actually need to restore that backup. Today, it does not have an asynchronous read replica available. I think that's coming down the line. It's not there today. Built on that, both the MySQL and PostgreSQL have some nice portal experience changes. So if we actually go back to that for a second, for example, if I go and look at my overview, we can actually see there's a nice getting started. I can see easily some key properties about the environment. I can quickly get access to some key monitoring data. I also have some tutorials I can go and look at. There's some great diagnose and solve problem areas that I can leverage. There are workbooks available to me that I can leverage. There's a nice backup restore blade. So just a whole bunch of features to really improve the overall utilization of this. Moving on, now, obviously SQL can run on Linux. So now there's SQL in IaaS VM agent for Linux. So there's a SQL agent for IaaS. So if I'm running SQL Server in a virtual machine, it's been there on Windows for a while. There's both a lightweight, where it just uses an extension and really just helps me with licensing. And then there's a full mode where it actually has an agent installed. Then it can help me back up and restore. It can help me apply updates to SQL and a bunch of other operational tasks. So what we have now is, even if I'm running SQL on Linux, in a lightweight mode only, so this is really about the licensing, it can now use that agent for me. And speaking of which, if I am using the lightweight agent on a Windows SQL and IaaS VM, I can now move to the full mode where it is using that agent and gives me all of those additional features without having to restart. So that's now GA, makes it easy to go and switch between them. Miscellaneous. So Azure Load testing has gone into preview. We're talking about test, test, test. And if we're in DevOps and we have our pipelines, our continuously integrating, continuously delivering, maybe deploying, we want to do different types of testing as part of that flow. And one of them is load testing. A very popular way to do that load testing is actually using this Apache JMeter. So Apache JMeter lets me give various parameters about emulating a certain number of users, certain types of interaction, is it HTTP, what they're doing. But I have to have a set of infrastructure stood up to do that. So Azure Load Testing is really an on-demand service that lets me do exactly that. It's using Apache JMeter scripts that I create, where I specify, hey, how many users do I want to emulate simultaneously engaging, what types of interactions, up to 25,000 concurrent users it can emulate for up to 3 hours. And then I say go. It integrates very well with GitHub Actions and Azure pipelines to do that testing for me. It can integrate with Azure Key Vault for storing secrets that I might need. And basically the way it's going to work is it's going to charge me based on the user effort hours. So I think there's a base price I pay, but I think it's super low. If we go and look super quickly at the pricing, right, so it's $10 a month, and you get that 50 virtual user hours per month. And then for additional user hours, I pay for the work it's doing. So this is a great way to really get that capability that in my pipelines, I want to do load testing. I don't want to set up a whole bunch of infrastructure to facilitate it. Well, now as a service, I can do that load testing and integrate it with my pipelines. Azure Monitor Logs now has its own audit log, so I can log the log. Basically what it's going to let me do, if I look at diagnostic settings now for Log Analytics Workspace, you'll see there's actually an option now for audit. So I can get information about, well, what the log was, what the query was, when was it run, what was the performance stats on the query, how it was run, what tool executed. So I can go and actually turn on an audit log now for a Log Analytics Workspace, and I can send it to all the usual suspects, a storage account, an event hub, or a Log Analytics Workspace. Azure Monitor Alert Processing Rules. So this is a new name for action rules. So if we quickly jump over, it's probably easy to see this. So the whole point of this is previously we had the idea of action groups. And an action group was a set of actions I wanted to perform. And what I would do is I would call those from a rule. But maybe I don't want to do that. Yes, I can create an alert rule and I can actually go and then call a certain action group. Actually, this has got the old name still. But in regular portals, I turn off a custom portal. This is now renamed. So what you should see here is this is going to be an alert processing rule. And what that lets me do is based on a certain scope, I can call an action group or I can actually suppress actions that would have happened. Hey, it's Christmas Day. I don't want to get alerted. But I now configure what I want to do at a scope, a certain maybe resource group, a certain level of actions. And then if alerts are raised, it triggers this. So now I can separate what happens from what actually triggered that alert to create. I can just say, hey, look, there's an alert at this scope. I go and perform whatever is in this. So it's being renamed to alert processing rules from what were action rules. Azure Cost Management has some updates. I think it was really 2 key updates. If we quickly go and look at this. Right, so I can now schedule an email that will fire off an email to me letting me know about some of the core cost analysis I have in my environment. You can go and set this up. I'll have the link in the description below. And there are now new cost recommendations for Azure Data Explorer and Cosmos DB. Things really to help me optimize my spend once again. And there's some other little bits of additional data. Moving on. So Azure AD now has custom attributes in preview. This is the idea. I can create these new attribute sets with certain attributes that I can set values to. This is probably easier to understand. So if we go and look, and this is actually really exciting. You might say, why is it really exciting? So if I look at my Azure AD, what we can now see is I have this option for custom security attributes. Now I went ahead and created this. So I created a set called project attribute set, and I created one attribute. And I've given it a set of predefined values. So Bravo, Gamma, Alpha. Once I've created that, what I can now do on my users is obviously I can set those. So if I go and look at me, for example, again, we can see I now have custom security attributes, and I set my project to Alpha. So I've given it a value. Now you might say, well, who cares? What's the big deal? Some types of object also have tags and attributes. This is different from the Azure Resource Manager. This is something specific to the data plane. For example, if I look at a storage account, if I look at my container, let's look at images. If I look at this image, we have something called blob index tags. And notice one, I have project here as well. And I have a project and it's equal to Alpha. Now, if I think ordinarily about giving people access to a subset of information, what I'd have to do in the past is make sure I put them in different containers, maybe different storage accounts. I have to have a whole bunch of different permission definitions to say, okay, well, this group, this is Project Alpha, they get permission to this set of resources, where I've gathered them together and they're Project Alpha. Well, with this, I don't need to anymore. I can actually use attribute-based access control. The user has an attribute of project, and the resource has an attribute called project. So now I can say in the permission, they have to be the same. So if we look at that, if I look at my role assignment, so a data plane role assignment, something like blob data reader, instead of just giving it generally, if I look at this blob data reader assignment that I'm going to do, so it's blob data reader, I have this option of view edit. And what this lets me do is put conditions on the assignment. So the assignment, sure, is, hey, I'm doing blob read. But this has to be true for me to get that permission. So the security principal primary project attribute has to equal, so I'm looking at the principal's project attribute has to be the same as the resources value in the key called project. So the resources project value has to be the same as the user's project value. And that's it. So I could have 50 different projects, one rule. So this is huge. This can really change the way we think about doing the permissions going forward. So that's why this is exciting. It's going to really change the way we can give people permissions to just the things they should have. And then something else, Azure AD Kerberos is in preview. Now, if we think about Azure AD, we always think about, well, Azure AD speaks cloud, OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, WSFed, SAML. Regular Active Directory speaks NTLM, Kerberos, LDAP, things like that. So what is this Azure AD Kerberos thing all about? And it's really targeted at specific scenarios today. Now, if we think about for a second, it's probably easier just to draw this out quickly. The whole point of Kerberos is it's that three-headed dog guarding the gates of Hades. So there's three parts to Kerberos. I can think about there's the identity provider. So the thing giving out the token, so kind of the STS. Then there's the client. And then there's some service I want to talk to. And the way Kerberos works is both of these have to kind of have a relationship with that service. So in this case, it's Azure AD. So what's happening with this? There's nothing changing about Azure Active Directory. I don't have to change anything about Azure AD. Azure AD is becoming its own Kerberos realm. It's kerberos.microsoftonline.com. So it can now give out tickets and ticket granting tickets. Now, the machine I'm connecting from, this has to be kind of Win10, I think it's 20H1 with the latest cumulative update, or 11 or server 2022, but only for interactive user authentication. What this is going to let me now do is for certain services. Now today, this is targeted at SQL managed instance where I want to do kind of Windows Auth. And it's targeted at Azure Virtual Desktop, the kind of FX logics, where it uses Azure Files, which historically I had to do strange things. I had to join the storage account to my regular Active Directory to make that work. But now what I can actually do is I can, for both of these, they can now basically get a relationship with Azure AD. It's really via an app we're going to get created, so they would have an identity. But this now allows these to actually go and ask for a token for one of these services, which they can get back and then present to authenticate. So this is using Kerberos. It's using Kerberos proxy, so it's over HTTPS, so it would eventually work over the internet. But this is the scenario today. It's focused around SQL MI using Windows authentication, and the Azure Virtual Desktop FX Logics, and where it uses Azure files for the storage of that. It's in preview. These scenarios will grow over time. Today, I cannot bring my own application that uses Kerberos authentication and use with this. Maybe over time, who knows? This is not trying to replace Active Directory in terms of group profiles and stuff like that. It's very much about trying to offer a Kerberos authentication with Azure AD. So today it's very scoped down to SQL MI Windows Auth and Azure Virtual Desktop FS Logics profiles on Azure files, but expect it to grow over time. I'll probably do a deeper dive video on this because that's cool. And if you know me, I like identity. But that was it. That was all of the updates for this week. I hope you found that useful. Until next time, take care and thanks for watching.